Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. And warmly, welcome to you, our listener, to this custom-tailored deep dive.
Yeah, we have a really incredible story to get into today.
We really do. I mean, imagine trying to feed 20 million starving people across the globe.
20 million. Just let that number sink in.
Right. And you have no internet?
No.
You have no massive government grants?
No modern supply chains or, international aid organizations to lean on.
Exactly. And you are starting this entire endeavor with exactly $30 in your pocket.
It sounds like fiction. I mean, it really does.
It totally does. You are a poor immigrant, you have a grade school education, and you're operating in a world that, hasn't even invented modern logistics yet.
Yeah, late 19th century.
Right. And somehow you don't just feed those people.
No, you build a media empire.
Right. You invent concepts that fundamentally alter publishing, and you single-handedly raise and distribute over $3.3 million.
Which is, that's turn of the century money.
Yeah. So that is the equivalent of hundreds of millions today.
Easily.
So our mission today is to explore the astonishing life and the truly staggering impact of a man named Louis Klopsch.
Yes, Klopsch.
We are piecing together his life from the definitive 1910 biography by Charles M. Pepper.
It's a fascinating book.
It is. And we're diving deep into the mechanisms of how one person managed to alter the survival trajectory of millions.
Because it really was millions.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can understand the mechanics of how he saved all these lives from the Volga River to the Bowery, we absolutely have to understand the business engine he built.
Right. This brilliant, aggressive, and highly unusual engine.
Because it funded everything.
Exactly. You really have to look at Klopsch the humanitarian and Klopsch the businessman as a single integrated operating system.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So he was born in Germany in 1852, and he immigrated to New York as a toddler.
And his family background is pretty intense, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. His father was a political refugee fleeing the 1848 revolutions in Europe.
Wow.
Yeah. And then his mother passed away shortly after they arrived.
That is just tragic.
It is. And because of that, he was pulled out of public school early because, survival was the immediate priority.
Right. You just have to work.
Exactly. But what emerged from that environment wasn't a defeated young man. It was someone with this almost gravitational understanding of publishing.
It's in marketing.
Right. And the psychology of crowds.
He understood human attention before, the attention economy was even a term.
Totally. In the early 1870s, barely out of his teens, he launches this 4-page weekly publication called Good Morning.
And the content was fine, but the genius was entirely in the distribution model.
Yes.
He didn't try to sell subscriptions to individuals.
Which is what everyone else was doing.
Right. Instead, he went to retail dealers, local dry goods stores, the shoe stores, the grocers in various New York neighborhoods.
And he offered them 1,000 copies of this beautifully printed, high-grade paper to hand out to their customers for free.
Right. Free to the customer. But the catch was, Klopsch let those local businesses print their own specific local advertisements inside their badge.
What's fascinating here is the underlying mechanism of that deal. He essentially invented a hyper-localized, sponsored content model.
Decades ahead of its time.
Decades. He wasn't selling news. He was selling targeted access to specific neighborhoods.
Yeah.
It allowed him to scale his printing operations without taking on the massive risk of finding individual subscribers.
Because finding individual subscribers is expensive.
Exactly. He used the merchant's existing foot traffic as his distribution network.
Which is brilliant.
Yeah.
And, he needed that kind of leverage because his financial realities were incredibly stark back then.
Very stark.
There is this moment from his early career that completely exposes his psychological wiring.
I love this story.
Right. So he's trying to build up his advertising and printing business, and he hits a wall.
A massive wall.
He has exactly $30 left to his name in ready cash.
Put yourself in that position in 1870s New York.
It's terrifying.
The natural logical instinct is conservation.
Yeah. You take that $30, you buy bulk flour, beans, coal.
Right, and you hunker down to survive the winter while you look for any kind of wage labor.
But Klopsch runs the exact opposite calculation.
Which is just wild.
He takes his final $30 and walks straight into a tailor shop.
Yes.
He buys a brand new suit, a sharp new necktie, and a new hat.
He goes to the barber for a shave.
Right. And he pays to have his boots professionally blacked.
He understood the concept of putting on a good front.
Yeah, he walked out of there completely broke, but looking like a wildly successful, heavily capitalized publisher.
And it worked. He immediately marched into business meetings and landed enough new contracts to permanently turn his situation around.
Because he knew that in the business world, people invest in momentum.
Exactly.
If you look desperate, you are a liability. If you look prosperous, you are an opportunity.
He was engineering trust through presentation.
Yeah.
But we have to distinguish that from mere deception, because beneath that incredibly bold marketing exterior was a rigid, almost mathematical, ethical code.
Right, he wasn't a con artist.
No, not at all. There was an incident later on when a young man, clearly desperate for work, came into Klopsch's office.
Yeah, there was a vacant position.
And the young man offered to do the job for significantly less than the standard advertised salary.
Just to ensure he wouldn't starve that month.
Exactly.
And from a purely capitalist perspective, that's an arbitrage opportunity for a business owner.
Right. You cut your overhead.
But Klopsch flatly rejects the offer.
He does. He tells the young man that the specific labor required for that role holds a definitive market value.
Yeah. If the man is competent to perform the work, he is mathematically entitled to the full salary.
Right. And if he isn't competent, offering to do it cheaply doesn't make him a bargain.
It makes him a liability.
Exactly. So he hired the man at full pay. He drew a hard line between aggressive business tactics and the exploitation of individual desperation.
It really reveals how he viewed human capital. He didn't see employees as line items to be minimized.
No, he saw them as engines that needed proper fuel to function optimally.
And this combination of an aggressive marketing mind and a deeply principled operational code is what eventually led him to Reverend T. DeWitt Talmage.
Yes, and at the time, Talmage was the pastor of the Brooklyn Tabernacle.
He was a phenomena.
He really was. He was drawing crowds that simply couldn't fit into the building.
Right, and the daily newspapers would occasionally print transcripts of his Monday morning sermons.
But the distribution was entirely chaotic.
And geographically limited.
Very limited.
So think about this in the context of a modern podcast network or a massive wire service like the Associated Press.
Right.
Klopsch looked at Talmage and saw a premium content creator whose reach was being artificially constrained by physical architecture.
Yeah, why should only the people who managed to get a seat in Brooklyn get the content?
Exactly. So in 1885, Klopsch approaches Talmage and engineers this massive syndication model.
Which was incredibly difficult back then.
Oh, yeah. He secures the sermon manuscripts in advance, sets them in type, and physically distributes those advanced copies to hundreds of newspapers worldwide.
He creates a synchronized release schedule.
Yes, so that a paper in London, a paper in San Francisco, and a paper in Chicago can all publish Talmage's sermon on the exact same day.
The logistics of doing that before widespread telephone networks or digital file transfers are staggering.
I mean, how did he even do it?
He was relying on the physical movement of mail via steam trains and ships.
Just massive coordination.
Right. Coordinating release embargoes with hundreds of independent editors.
And this syndication partnership forged a deep bond between the two men. They traveled extensively together.
Including a trip to England in 1889.
And that is where Klopsch crosses paths with a struggling British religious paper called the Christian Herald.
This is the turning point.
It really is. He takes over the American edition, eventually buying it outright. And this is the pivot point for everything that follows.
Because when he takes control, the circulation is sitting at a modest 30,000.
Which is okay, but not massive.
Right. And people in the publishing industry thought he was delusional when he publicly stated his goal was to bring it up to 250,000 subscribers.
That's a huge leap.
But he systematically dismantled the old, localized way of running a religious paper.
He applied his aggressive syndication and marketing tactics.
And he hit that 250,000 mark.
And in doing so, he built something far more powerful than a profitable business.
He constructed an unprecedented communication apparatus.
Yeah. In one of his editorials, he laid out his philosophy of media.
I love this quote.
He wrote that a printing press could be used to break 1,000,000 chains and give resurrection to 1,000,000 of the dead.
He recognized that the press was a lever of infinite mechanical advantage.
He proved that achieving massive commercial success was the necessary prerequisite for achieving massive philanthropic leverage.
Right. You cannot be a world-class philanthropist if you do not have a world-class revenue engine driving the operation.
Exactly. So, having built this colossal publishing megaphone, reaching hundreds of thousands of deeply engaged, trusting readers every single week,
Klopsch realized he possessed a tool that could do more than circulate ideas.
he could use it to move literal physical mountains of food across the planet.
Which brings us to 1892 and the transition from publisher to a master of global humanitarian logistics.
And the setting here is the Russian Volga Basin.
Right. This is an immense agricultural zone, easily comparable in size and critical food production to the American Mississippi Valley.
But the ecosystem utterly collapsed.
Successive brutal droughts followed by insect plagues just decimated the wheat and rye crops.
So you suddenly have 20 million peasants trapped in a massive geographical area with absolutely zero food production.
20 million people.
And the physiological reality of what was happening there is devastating. People were surviving on something they called hunger bread.
If you can even call it bread.
Right. It wasn't bread at all. They were taking earth, straw, stable refuse.
And mixing it with a tiny bit of dry bran sweepings.
Yeah. And they baked it into a dark, dense block that was so hard it would literally bend the blade of a knife.
It's just horrifying.
It smelled like dog feed. It provided almost zero caloric or nutritional value.
And they were feeding this to infants and the elderly.
Count Leo Tolstoy actually traveled through these regions and documented the horror.
Yeah, his accounts are chilling.
Stepping into windowless, freezing huts with dirt floors.
Finding multiple generations huddled on top of a clay stove.
Delirious from starvation and raging typhus.
The scale of the suffering was paralyzing to most observers.
But when the reports reached New York, Klopsch didn't just write a sympathetic editorial.
No, he immediately engaged his logistical mindset.
He started running the mathematics of survival.
He calculated that, based on current American commodities markets, a 190-pound barrel of sound, highly nutritious American flour cost exactly $3.50.
Which is incredible to think about today.
Right. And $10 would procure nearly 3 barrels, which equated to 570 standard loaves of bread.
So he takes these calculations and opens a dedicated relief fund inside the Christian Herald.
And he doesn't target the Gilded Age billionaires.
No.
He targets his readers. He asks for $1, a $50, nickels, and pennies.
And the capital pools rapidly. When the fund hits $20,000, he executes this massive logistical maneuver.
He charters a massive steamship called the Leo for $10,000.
And to optimize his capital, he sells the deck privileges of the ship to a lumber company for $2,500 to offset the charter cost.
Which is just smart business.
Yeah. And then he fills the entire hold with nearly 3 million pounds of flour.
3 million pounds. The mechanics of moving 3 million pounds of grain from the American Midwest to the eastern seaboard onto a steamship and across the Atlantic.
It requires an astonishing level of coordination.
It really does.
Wait, I'm looking at this immense logistical nightmare, and I have to ask the obvious question.
Okay.
Why go through the friction of chartering a physical ship, buying the grain in America, loading it, and sailing it for weeks across the ocean?
Right.
If you have $20,000 in liquid capital, why not simply wire the funds directly to the Russian authorities or local agents and let them buy food from neighboring unaffected regions? It seems so much faster.
That is the instinct of modern banking.
Right.
But it completely ignores the terrifying economics of a closed system famine.
How so?
Well, when an agricultural region the size of the Volga Basin fails, it doesn't just create a food shortage, it creates instantaneous, catastrophic hyperinflation.
Oh, wow.
The moment you wire $20,000 of cash into that starving ecosystem, the local merchants, if they even have a few sacks of grain hidden away, will immediately raise their prices to astronomical levels.
Because demand is infinite and supply is zero.
Exactly. A single loaf of bread could suddenly cost a month's wages. Cash becomes a totally useless abstraction to a starving peasant if the physical supply of grain does not exist or is priced out of reach.
That makes total sense.
By taking the friction of shipping the actual physical commodity, Klopsch entirely bypassed the local price gouging networks.
He injected millions of raw physical calories directly into the starved ecosystem.
Right. This not only guaranteed the immediate biological survival of the people eating the flour, but the sudden influx of supply naturally forced the local black market prices back down.
He solved the economic failure by addressing the physical supply failure.
It's brilliant.
It really is. So while the Leo is crossing the Atlantic, Klopsch and Reverend Talmage travel to Russia to serve as their own advance agents.
Because they need to ensure the distribution networks are in place before the ship docks.
Right, because 3 million pounds of flour sitting on a pier doesn't help anyone.
Exactly.
When the Leo finally sails into St. Petersburg in July of 1892, it's an unprecedented scene.
The Russian authorities have exactly 100 freight cars lined up on the dock,
Festooned with Russian and American flags.
waiting to immediately distribute the cargo deep into the interior.
And the diplomatic reception was equally massive.
Yeah, the mayor of St. Petersburg presented the captain of the Leo with an ornate oaken box holding a speaking trumpet.
And the first mate was given a silver drinking cup.
The gratitude reached the absolute highest levels of the empire. Klopsch and Talmage were summoned to the Peterhof Palace for a formal audience with the Tsarevich.
The crown prince who would shortly ascend the throne as Tsar Nicholas II.
Right. And the prince specifically requested they carry Russia's profound thanks back to the ordinary American citizens who funded the operation.
So Klopsch had successfully built a blueprint for global disaster relief.
Yes.
And he didn't just put it on a shelf. He scaled it.
He did. When devastating monsoon failure famines struck India in 1897, and then again in 1900, he activated the exact same mechanism.
He chartered massive ships like the City of Everett and the Quito.
And the environmental realities of the Indian famine were a different kind of horror than the freezing Russian steppes.
We are talking about streams of gaunt, skeletal people walking 30 miles in blistering, unrelenting heat just to reach a designated relief station.
Klopsch traveled to India himself during the 1900 crisis to oversee the operations.
And he witnessed the psychological breaking point of starvation.
He documented scenes where parents, driven to absolute madness by the sight of their children starving, were offering to sell their sons and daughters to strangers for a few annas.
Which is just a fraction of a cent.
Exactly. And they weren't doing this out of malice.
No, it was the ultimate agonizing sacrifice.
Right. They believed that whoever bought the child would be forced to feed them.
Securing the child's survival, even if it meant permanent separation.
It is the absolute collapse of the human condition.
Yet Klopsch's logistical machine cut through that despair. There is a deeply moving scene when the relief ship Quito finally arrives in Bombay.
The local authorities and missionaries gather right there on the docks, and they literally sample the cargo.
They open the sacks of American corn to prove that the food had survived the long oceanic journey perfectly fresh.
And was ready to be distributed. The system worked.
It really did. But, the logistics of natural disaster relief, while incredibly complex, operated on a very straightforward moral plane.
Yes. A monsoon fails, a drought hits, people starve, you bring them food.
There is no political ambiguity.
Right. But as Klopsch's relief apparatus grew in fame and efficiency, he found himself dragged into complex, human-made geopolitical disasters.
He had to learn to navigate the politics of suffering.
Where maintaining strict neutrality wasn't just a diplomatic courtesy, it was the only way to keep people alive.
This becomes starkly apparent during the Armenian massacres under Turkish rule in 1894 and 1895.
And as we discuss this, we are strictly looking at the logistical challenges Klopsch faced based on the historical accounts detailed in the biography.
Right. American missionaries stationed in the region were sending back horrific reports of mass violence and the systematic destruction of villages.
And as winter approached, the surviving populations were left utterly destitute without shelter or food.
So Klopsch had to move capital into a highly volatile conflict zone without escalating the political tensions.
He utilized his established network of local actors. In the city of Van, an American missionary named Miss Kimball utilized the funds raised by the Christian Herald to establish a massive industrial relief station.
She managed to feed 1,500 people daily.
And organize the distribution of heavy winter clothing to those who had fled the violence.
Navigating the delicate balance of providing life-saving aid in the midst of a violent political crisis.
Exactly. But the collision between humanitarian aid and international diplomacy reached an absolute boiling point in 1901.
Yeah. Ellen Stone.
Right. She was an American missionary working in Macedonia, which was then under Turkish administration.
And she was kidnapped by a group of Macedonian brigands.
She was taken along with a companion, Mrs. Silka.
Who was heavily pregnant.
Yes, and actually gave birth while they were being held hostage in the mountains.
The brigands issued a massive ransom demand. And they attached a terrifying timeline.
They communicated that if the specific financial demands were not met by a set date, they would execute Miss Stone with a bullet.
And they would use another bullet for Mrs. Silka and her newborn baby.
The United States State Department was immediately involved.
And it sparked a fierce nationwide debate about the ethics of paying ransoms.
Because it's a complicated issue.
Put yourself in the room where these decisions are being made. The State Department is looking at the geopolitical chessboard.
Right.
They're arguing that crowdsourcing a ransom for kidnappers creates a glaring, catastrophic moral hazard.
Because if you pay these brigands, aren't you essentially putting a massive price tag on the head of every single American missionary, diplomat, and traveler in the world?
Exactly. You are incentivizing the very violence you're trying to stop.
It is the definitive hostage dilemma. The diplomatic theory is that you must never negotiate because the long-term precedent endangers more lives than it saves.
But Klopsch looked at the situation through a lens of absolute, immediate pragmatism.
Yes. While the bureaucrats debated the theoretical future risks, Klopsch looked at the undeniable present reality.
A woman and a newborn baby were sitting in a freezing mountain camp, days away from being murdered.
For Klopsch, the immediate biological survival of those specific human beings overrode any abstract diplomatic precedent.
He mobilized the Christian Herald.
The American public responded with overwhelming financial force.
The ransom was delivered, and the hostages were released completely unharmed.
He flatly refused to let people be sacrificed on the altar of diplomatic theory.
We see this same intense focus on localized pragmatism during the massive Chinese floods of 1901 and 1906.
Millions of people living along the Grand Canal were displaced, their crops completely washed away.
And this was occurring just after the Boxer Rebellion.
Right, a period characterized by intense, violent, anti-foreign sentiment.
So sending in a massive team of Western administrators to hand out food would have been a political disaster.
Klopsch understood the cultural friction points. He worked in tandem with the American Red Cross, and he secured the backing of President Theodore Roosevelt and Secretary of State Elihu Root.
The U.S. government actually provided massive troop ships, the Buford and the Logan, to transport the relief cargo across the Pacific.
But the genius was in what happened when the ships arrived.
Klopsch rarely allowed his own people to handle the final distribution of the food.
He completely decentralized the operational control.
The biography paints this incredible picture on the banks of the Grand Canal.
You have traditional Chinese junks moored alongside a massive Buddhist temple.
The boats are loaded with American flour.
And working side by side are local Chinese civic volunteers and American missionaries who had lived in the region for decades.
They are physically carrying the heavy sacks of flour through a stockade right past a towering statue of Buddha,
distributing it directly to the local leaders.
Klopsch knew that the only way to prevent administrative waste, avoid looting, and bypass political hostility was to put the food directly into the hands of the reputable locals.
People who already spoke the language and understood the community dynamics.
He essentially invented a franchise model for international aid.
Raise the massive capital centrally through his media empire, but distribute the operational authority locally to the people on the ground.
It was an incredibly sophisticated mechanism that earned him decorations from the Emperor of Japan and the King of Italy.
But amidst all this global acclaim, Klopsch experienced a profound paradigm shift regarding the geography of suffering.
He realized he was moving ships across oceans to find starving people when he could just take a carriage ride downtown.
He only needed to look at the streets of his own city.
He only needed to look at the Bowery in New York.
The Bowery in the 1890s was the absolute terminus for the city's broken men.
The biography refers to them as the human driftwood of a great city.
In 1895, Klopsch took on the immense financial and operational responsibility of the struggling Bowery Mission.
And he immediately imported his grand-scale logistical thinking to the problem of urban poverty.
Right.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you look at standard 19th century urban missions, they operated on a very rigid, highly conditional model of charity.
Yes.
A hungry man comes in from the cold, but before he can get a bowl of thin, watery soup, he is forced to sit on a hard wooden bench.
And listen to a 2-hour sermon about his moral failings and his imminent damnation.
The food was held hostage by the theology.
Klopsch completely dismantled that conditional architecture. He introduced a philosophy of preaching with bread.
He established a massive nightly bread line that could efficiently feed up to 1,800 men a night.
1,800 men a night. And he built free medical dispensaries right there in the mission.
He organized massive clothing drives and provided emergency rent assistance during the catastrophic economic winter of 1893 and 1894.
When banks were failing and unemployment was skyrocketing.
It perfectly mirrors the modern sociological concept of housing first, or food first initiatives.
It really does. Klopsch looked at a man shaking from cold and starvation and realized, you cannot preach to a starving nervous system.
Right. The brain literally cannot process moral or spiritual instruction when the body is in acute biological distress.
You have to stabilize the baseline physiological needs. You have to feed the body before you can even begin to address the mind.
By stripping away the judgment, he completely changed the psychological atmosphere of the mission.
It wasn't a place of punishment, it was a sanctuary.
The biography details the incredible influence of Mrs. Sarah J. Bird,
a wealthy woman who abandoned high society to become known as the mother of the Bowery,
dedicating her life to serving these men without an ounce of condescension.
It was a place of visceral reality. There is a tragic account of a funeral held for an old, broken man named Henry McCluskey,
who literally died by falling down the stairs in the crush of a crowded service.
It was a hard, unforgiving world, but the mission provided a pocket of absolute grace.
And that grace caught the attention of the highest office in the land. In 1909, President William Howard Taft decided to visit the Bowery Mission.
Picture the intense juxtaposition of this scene.
It is late at night in one of the most dangerous, impoverished neighborhoods in America.
Suddenly, the street fills with police cordons and Secret Service agents.
And the President of the United States walks through the doors of the mission to address a room packed with hundreds of homeless, discarded men.
And Taft doesn't deliver a sterile political stump speech about economic policy.
He stands at the podium, looks out over this sea of faceless men who have been told by society that they are entirely worthless, and he addresses them directly as my boys.
He speaks to their specific psychological state. He tells them that the nation has not forgotten them.
He acknowledges the crushing weight of their desperation.
And he assures them that the societal desire to help the fallen is growing stronger.
It was a moment of profound psychological validation for men who hadn't been treated as human beings in years.
Taft's empathy perfectly mirrored Klopsch's own sociological analysis of the Bowery.
Klopsch didn't view these men as a collection of irredeemable sinners or lazy vagrants.
He understood the migration patterns of the era. He saw them as ambitious, capable country boys who had left their farms to make it big in the terrifying machinery of the city.
They took a risk, they failed, the city chewed them up.
And the only thing keeping them trapped on the streets was a profound, paralyzing sense of shame.
They were simply too embarrassed to write a letter home and admit they had been defeated.
Klopsch designed the mission to break through that shame.
But Klopsch was also a systems thinker.
Yes. He realized that rescuing 50-year-old men from the Bowery, while noble and necessary, was entirely reactive.
He was catching people at the very bottom of the waterfall.
He knew that to truly solve the problem, he had to travel upstream.
He had to build systems to catch the next generation before the cycle of poverty and despair could even begin.
He applied this proactive, systemic thinking globally and locally.
On the international front, after he delivered the flour to India and China, he didn't just pack up the ships and declare victory.
He knew that the famines had left tens of thousands of children completely orphaned.
So he utilized the Christian Herald to establish massive sinking funds.
These were essentially highly structured trust funds designed to provide permanent, long-term financial support.
He partnered with local figures, like the renowned Pundita Ramabai in India,
funding massive industrial and educational complexes so these orphans wouldn't just survive the famine, but would be trained with the skills to rebuild their local economies.
He was moving from emergency caloric stabilization to long-term economic development.
But his most cherished project, the one that animated him more than any global triumph, was focused strictly on the children of New York.
He founded a summer estate called Mont-Lawn, located in Nyack-on-the-Hudson,
specifically designed as a retreat for the tenement children of the city.
Over his lifetime, he organized the logistics to bring more than 40,000 children out of the slums for 10-day immersive retreats.
To understand why this matters, you have to mentally place yourself in the sensory reality of a child living in a New York tenement in the 1890s.
We aren't talking about a small apartment.
We are talking about windowless interior rooms. The air is stagnant, heavy with the smell of rotting refuse and choking coal dust.
The ground is entirely brick, stone, and mud. The noise of street vendors, screaming neighbors, and iron-wheeled carts on cobblestone is constant.
The biography notes that many of these children had literally never seen a blade of grass growing out of the earth.
They had never heard the sound of a bird singing in a tree.
Their entire neurological map of the world was gray, loud, and harsh.
Now imagine the absolute system-shocking contrast.
That child is placed on a train or a ferry, leaving that oppressive heat.
And a few hours later, they step off onto the sprawling, sunlit, vibrant green lawns of a massive estate overlooking the Hudson River.
The sheer visual and auditory contrast was staggering.
The biography describes children staring at the massive trees in absolute paralyzed wonder.
Touching the leaves as if they had just landed on an alien planet.
Klopsch made sure he was at Mont-Lawn as often as his empire allowed, and he understood the psychology of these kids.
He didn't lecture them, he told them stories.
His favorite was a fable about a magnificent, pure white Florentine marble statue that was placed in the center of a gritty, impoverished neighborhood in Italy.
According to the fable, a dirty, deeply neglected little girl from the slums stopped to stare at this statue.
She was so profoundly moved by the sight of something so clean, so pure, and so beautiful
that she ran back to her miserable hovel, scrubbed her own face, and began furiously cleaning her home, driven by an overwhelming desire to emulate the beauty she had witnessed.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
you see exactly what Klopsch was attempting to engineer. He knew he couldn't keep these children at Mont-Lawn forever.
They had to go back to the coal dust and the brick of the tenements.
But he wanted the memory of Mont-Lawn to function as their Florentine statue.
He wanted to implant a core memory of peace, beauty, and safety deep in their minds, giving them a psychological anchor.
He believed that if they knew a better world existed, they would fight to pull themselves up toward it.
He was attempting to permanently alter their psychological trajectory.
But the reality of running Mont-Lawn, funding the Bowery Mission, and maintaining trust funds in India required a staggering amount of continuous capital.
To sustain this multi-million-dollar philanthropic leviathan, Klopsch had to constantly innovate within his core engine, his publishing business.
And his ultimate legacy in that arena is a masterclass in mass market media and a revolution in corporate transparency.
He was a relentless innovator. For example, he conceived of, designed, and published the very first red-letter Bible.
He made the decision to print every single word directly attributed to Christ in bright red ink.
Today, that is a standard feature in millions of Bibles.
But Klopsch invented the formatting to make the text more visually accessible and engaging for the everyday working-class reader.
He understood user experience design a century before it was a recognized field.
He was also the primary logistical and editorial force behind the massive 1907 and 1908 congressional campaign
that successfully fought to restore the motto, "In God We Trust," to American coinage.
He had his hands on the levers of national culture.
But the detail in the biography that truly blew my mind was his absolute obsession with the mechanics of accounting.
Keep in mind, this is the turn of the 20th century.
The nonprofit sector is essentially a Wild West. There are no massive government oversight boards enforcing transparency.
Yet, Klopsch carried a specific vest pocket notebook everywhere he went.
Inside that tiny book, he could mentally compute his exact printing costs down to the fraction of a cent.
Cross-reference it with his advertising rates, and calculate the global shipping logistics for his charities.
He managed the pulse of a global financial empire in a leather book no bigger than a deck of cards.
And he didn't keep those numbers secret. This is where he fundamentally changed the rules of engagement for philanthropy.
He became a pioneer of extreme charity auditing.
If you look at the back pages of the 1910 biography, you don't just see summaries. You see page after page of dense certified accountants' reports.
He brought in massive, reputable firms, including early iterations of Ernst & Ernst, to audit his books.
He published these incredibly detailed financial tables right in the pages of the Christian Herald,
tracking every single penny of the $3.3 million he raised.
So what does this all mean?
Consider the psychological impact of that decision on his readers. Why does publishing a boring spreadsheet of printing costs and flour barrel receipts fundamentally change the nature of his charity?
Because it proves that financial transparency is not an administrative burden. It is the ultimate marketing engine for trust.
Before Klopsch, giving to a distant charity felt like throwing coins into a black hole.
You had no idea if the money bought food or lined a corrupt administrator's pockets.
By publishing those Ernst & Ernst audits, Klopsch effectively said to the working-class reader in Ohio, "Here is exactly where your nickel went. It bought this much grain on this specific ship, and it fed this specific village.
He built an architecture of absolute undeniable accountability.
Because the readers trusted his mathematics, they trusted his mission.
That is why they continue to fund his massive operations year after year, famine after famine.
Accountability is the engine of sustained generosity.
It is the perfect synthesis of the businessman and the humanitarian.
And it brings us back to the sheer breathtaking scope of what this man accomplished.
Louis Klopsch arrived in New York as a toddler, possessing absolutely nothing.
He leveraged $30 into a suit,
Built a localized media distribution network,
created an international syndication empire.
and then utilized that massive lever to move literal mountains of grain.
He intervened in hyperinflated famine economies in Russia and India.
He stared down hostage crises in Macedonia and navigated post-war tensions in China.
He stripped the judgment from urban rescue missions on the Bowery.
And he gave tens of thousands of tenement children a glimpse of a beautiful world.
He became an arbiter of nations, decorated by kings and emperors.
Yet he requested that his legacy be defined by his love for those children on the lawns of the Hudson River.
It is a staggering operational life.
And dissecting the mechanics of how he achieved it leaves us with a profound, highly relevant question for our own era.
Today, when we are confronted with massive systemic crises, whether it is global supply chain failures, international conflicts, or domestic poverty,
our modern reflex is to look upward. We assume the problem is too large for individuals, so we wait for a mega corporation, a tech billionaire, or a massive federal agency to swoop in and engineer a solution.
we sit back and wait for someone else to write the giant check.
Precisely. But the mechanics of Louis Klopsch's empire prove the exact opposite.
He raised the modern equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars almost entirely through microscopic, decentralized donations.
He built a global relief navy using the pennies, nickels, and dimes of everyday working-class people who simply read a weekly paper and trusted the man running the spreadsheet.
It forces us to ask, in our highly connected modern era, have we lost the architecture of democratized mega-charity?
Or have we simply forgotten the immense, world-altering mechanical power of a highly mobilized, united community that implicitly trusts its leadership?
It's an incredible thought for you to mull over. Klopsch proved that you don't need $1 billion in your own bank account to move the world.
You just need to build a lever of absolute transparency and find 1 million people willing to push down on it together.
Exactly. Thank you so much for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive into the extraordinary logistics and life of Louis Klopsch.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope exploring these mechanisms gave you a fresh perspective, and we warmly encourage you to keep questioning the systems around you and keep learning.